It's been about 6 months since the Tortured Poets department came out, and I wanted to talk about that. I figured now's about as good a time as any to do that. It's been a hell of a year for pop music, both on the mainstream and indie ends. And I know it's easy to just chalk that up to poptimism or people just being kinder to mainstream pop releases, but I mean that for 2024. A lot of good, really, really good albums have come out in pop this year. And the biggest of them by quite some distance is the Tortured Poets department. Yet, out of all of them, I think it's the most difficult for me to place exactly how I feel about it. And when determining how good it is, I found that my feelings on the matter weren't so easy to sum up in just one sentence. Now, I'll be the first to admit I wasn't a particularly huge fan of Taylor Swift, and I'm still not, but I want to be. And that isn't to say that I want to become a devoted Swiftie, it's to say that I want to enjoy good music, no matter what the sources of it were or that person's previous works up until that point. And when watching the Grammys earlier this year, I will admit I was interested when I saw that announcement.
Which is that my brand new album comes out April 19th. It's called The Tortured Poets Department.
So I said to myself, you know what, I've never listened to a Taylor Swift album on release date. Let me do that. I made that decision 6 months ago, and it's taken 6 months for me to determine exactly how I feel about what I heard. Obviously, if I thought it was super good or really terrible, it probably wouldn't have taken me so long to do that. And I don't think it's an interesting way to talk about things by saying that it's peak or trash all the time. So I felt that this warranted some level of lengthy discussion on the matter. And I think there's about 3 main points I could think of when talking about the album where I think it went right or where I think it went wrong that I think best describe my feelings on the matter. So let's talk about that. Now, starting off with the first thing you actually hear on the album, it's production, how the thing actually sounds. Principal production of this album was carried out mainly by 3 people, Taylor herself, Jack Antonoff, and Aaron Dessner. Now, I'm not very familiar with a lot of Aaron's stuff at all, really, but I am with Jack Antonoff. I imagine a lot of people who listen to pop music would be. Jack's been everywhere in the last decade. I want to say over the last 10 years, he's produced for something like 70 different records. And that's impressive, and there's a lot of good stuff in those 70 different records. Off the top of my head, Lord's Melodrama or Lana Del Rey's Norman fucking Rockwell are 2 of my favorite albums of all time. Jack's really, really good at what he does, but I just think that when anyone's that prolific, it will eventually bite into how good the quantity of your stuff is, you know? And someone's going to get the leftovers, and I think that's what happened here. Now, genre-wise, if I had to describe this album in a couple sentences, I'd say it's a mix of synth-pop work, pretty similar to a lot of the stuff that she did on her previous album, Midnights, which came out 2 years ago, and some of the folk, more introspective kind of sounds that she was doing on records like Folklore and Evermore from a couple years back. On paper, that's a pretty good mix. You could get something that sounds really nice out of that. But out of all of the Taylor Swift albums I've heard in my life, this was one of the ones that I think I have struggled the most to remember how anything sounds. There's a lot of songs on this album, and it's really difficult for me to be able to discern more than even 5 of them apart. It all feels really washed out. None of it really felt super punchy, super impactful, and it just kind of felt like songs really just blended into another after a while. I remember at the time when I was still listening to it, I was writing down my thoughts on every single song on my phone, and the initial thought patterns were a lot more detailed. I could think of, okay, I like how this thing sounds. I appreciate what this was written about. But by the end of those 31 songs, I just had less than a sentence to say about each individual song. Now, it being a long album is something I'm going to get to in a minute, but I think now's a good time to talk about other artists who feature on this album, or the lack thereof. Across these 31 songs, there are just 2 features. Post Malone on the first track and union-mandated #1 hit Fortnite, and Florence and the Machine on the song Florida. Florida was actually one of the few times I remember liking something and the way it sounded on this album. I thought it was pretty punchy, and I thought that it stuck with me in a way I would have really appreciated. It doesn't necessarily mean this album had to be feature-laden and star-studded all across the place. That's not at all the case. In fact, a lot of mainstream pop records this year have either been feature-free or very, very sparsely populated with features. So that's not exactly out of the ordinary for the Tortured Poets, but none of them were quite so long as the Tortured Poets, and it means that you're going at it for 29 out of 31 songs with just Taylor, and more Taylor. And it's alright for an album to be really long. Thinking back to 2004, Outkast's Speaker Box, The Love Below, that album is about 2 hours long, but it's about as thorough an exploration of those 2 genres that were melded together on that album as I think you could get. Whereas I just don't think that really panned out on this album to at all the same extent. In previous years, when talking to friends or family about any old Taylor Swift song, people knew them at the very least. And granted, I'm not in the United States, we don't have the same exposure to Taylor Swift down here, but people who I know who aren't dedicated Taylor Swift fans really just don't know a lot of the songs on this new album. And I think that's kind of for a reason. I just think they're a bit hard to remember. They're not meaningfully different enough from one another to stand out on their own, you know? Now, one thing I have seen online is people chalking up this album's production deficits with the fact that this is far from the first Taylor Swift-Jack Antonoff collaboration. And, you know, once you do something for too long, you just kind of reach the end of originality and creativity. And I don't think I agree. I think Jack's production style has become as popular as it has in popular music for a reason. I think one of the criticisms I levy against this album is that some of the songs sound really washed out, but I don't think even that's a negative. I think something that sounds washed out, so to speak, is, again, from Melodrama, the song Homemade Dynamite. The beat and the drums and that sound almost sound really far away when you listen to it on headphones, but it's one of my absolute favorite things about that song.
Let's let things come out of the woodwork. I give you my best, I tell you I'm my best.
And again, just last year, did you know that there's a tunnel under Ocean Boulevard by Lana Del Rey? That also came courtesy of Jack Antonoff. I don't think the man is out of ideas. Far from it. And I also don't think Taylor is an artist who tends to be relatively safe in terms of her sound. She's someone who's reinvented her image and sonic presentation a lot. I think there's still a lot that could have been done here. I just don't think it was. And I think if there's any one thing that contributes to how this album sounds and the way it just gets to drag on you, is that it drags. And it drags because it's too long. It's way too long. It is extremely long. It's too long. It's long. Now, taking it seriously for a second, yeah, it's too long. The Tortured Poets Apartment was initially fashioned as being a 16-song long album, but after a surprise Twitter announcement from Taylor, I want to say about 2 hours after release, it then actually turned out that the album was going to be extended to 31 songs over 122 minutes. This is not just longer than every other mainstream pop record of the year, it is tremendously longer, to the point where most other releases aren't even half or so much as a third as long as the Tortured Poets. And veering out of pop music for a second, Hip hop has been dealing with some really, really bad problems with messy track lists that have yielded some really, really bloated albums. Yet, even when thinking about Utopia, Donda, or the Scary Hours 3 extended edition of For All the Dogs, Tortured Poets still comes out as the victor in the ultimate length competition. When you're listening to an album that is more than feature length, it exacerbates the problem of the songs sounding really similar to one another. An hour and a half in, you just don't remember what you heard as the third song, and an hour and a half still means you have over 30 minutes left of this album. I wanted to compare this to really the only pop-adjacent album this year to come out with even close to a similar length, and that's Beyonce's Cowboy Carter. I think both Cowboy Carter and The Tortured Poets are albums that try to go about talking about a lot of things. They talk about personal issues, they talk about how the individual making them is viewed on a greater basis, and I believe they are high concept in a way that you don't need to be intelligent to understand it, but a high concept in a way that clearly a hell of a lot of money went into making these albums. I bring up Cowboy Carter because when Cowboy Carter came out and I saw 27 songs over 78 minutes, I was concerned as to its length. Yet, when doing the direct comparison, it's just not really the same. Despite how heavy and how layered that album is in terms of its subject matter, almost all the time, Cowboy Carter ends up being the shorter record. I believe all the songs on average come out to about 3 minutes, whereas for the Tortured Poets, it's usually about 4, and that's with the benefit of including the second half. If you don't include the anthology tracks here, then the average song length of the album goes up to beyond 4 minutes, and I think that's really noticeable. Now, 4 minutes is not a long song by any stretch of the imagination, but it will be once you've heard 30 of them back to back to back to back to back to back. And I think if this album was even half as long, I would have come out of it with a significantly improved view and opinion over what I was hearing. Eventually, you just kind of get to the point where, because it all sounds the same, and because it all sounds the same for so long, that you just kind of can't care anymore. But I don't think the length of this album had to necessarily ruin things for it. I think both the extremely long length and the fairly homogeneous sound could have been made up for with one thing, really. Now, with a name like The Tortured Poets Department, you'd obviously expect the writing to be the centerpiece of this album, and I think that happens to be the case here. The Tortured Poets is an album that delves very heavily into Taylor's own state of emotions, how she experiences being Taylor Swift on a day-to-day basis. These are things I cannot opine on, so it's difficult for me to even talk about what is and isn't appealing about them for me because, well, I'm not Taylor Swift, and I think she is this album's best audience. And now, since I'm not Taylor Swift and I'm missing a lot of the personal context that probably makes these songs a lot more meaningful, all I can really talk about is how well I think some ideas and emotions were conveyed to me as a casual listener. And for me, I just didn't connect super heavily with it. Now, The Tortured Poets is not a particularly happy album, which is fine. Certainly has no obligation to make and release music like that. In fact, I would say her discography is largely not that. And I think it's okay for an album to be miserable, if you will, on a listen. I think Kendrick Lamar's most recent release was also a very unhappy record. And that album's great. That's his second best album, and I mean that. So I don't think The Tortured Poets not being very happy was particularly a problem. I will say some of these ideas and concepts are not new to Taylor's brand and image. I think being pretty publicly upset with how she is perceived, the way that she has been involved in personal feuds and personal dramas, has something that she's been talking about on a pretty loud basis since at least Reputation, and Reputation came out 7 years ago, and if time works the way I think it will, we're due for a Reputation re-release sometime in the near future, so you'll be hearing songs like that pretty soon. My main issue, though, is that I think some of these problems and feelings are communicated a little clumsily, just with a couple lines and sentences that I just don't think come across super well. It's easy for me to just put across like genius screen caps of cringy bars and sentences like people didn't make fun of them 6 months ago. But the fact that lines like these really exist, it just kind of takes you out of listening to the album. I really think I've pinpointed why I think the writing just didn't connect and touch to me. When looking at the song So Long London, I didn't really even know who the song was about. I just kind of presumed that it was a guy she dated who was from the UK. I did not know that her ex-boyfriend Joe Alwyn was a British man, or is, he's not dead. But I missed that context because I do not know that much about her personal life. And I think that's why I think this album misses for me. I think this is an album made for her fans, and she has a hell of a lot of fans. More fans than I think I could possibly fathom, given an hour to think about it. But I just so happen to not be one of them. And so I miss the context of which songs are about Maddie Healy, which songs are about Joe Alwyn, which songs are about people who have personally wronged her and her public relations. She's had a lot of well-known dramas, feuds, and just things that have happened throughout her career. And as somebody who's not that personally invested into her going-ons, it means that these songs don't carry nearly as much weight as I think they would for somebody who does happen to care a hell of a lot about Taylor's personal life. That isn't to say that it's a complete black hole. There were more than a few times in this album where I understood the emotion conveyed and felt something. The second song on this album, which I honestly would have made the opener just because I think it encapsulates what the theming of this album is so well, the title track, Tortured Poets Department, it really paints a very vivid picture for me of somebody who's torn between longing, torn between being unhappy with the circumstance they currently find themselves in. That's something that hits hard for almost anyone. There's blips of that all across the album, but I just don't think that it meshes together in a way that I think makes for a really, really strong album experience. Maybe as a singles experience, listening to each individual song that happens to relate to you and that stage of life that you're going through, maybe I think that would make the album more impactful. And if I did have any songs from this album to recommend, that's probably the way I think I would go about it. I recognize that this was likely a very therapeutic album for her to make. I think she said as much actually in an interview, and I don't doubt that. But as I said earlier, I'm not her, and I'm not a particular fan of her, so I don't have a lot of the context and a lot of the memories and experiences that would have made this album a lot more interesting and impactful. So unfortunately, I think after all this time, I've just kind of come to the conclusion that I thought this album was really middling. Now, why am I talking about this? What does it matter as to whether or not I personally did or did not enjoy a piece of music? And it doesn't matter. But I think it's fun to talk about music. I think it's fun to talk about music that I both did and did not enjoy. And I think it's especially fun to talk about as to why I didn't enjoy that piece of music. One group of people, though, who I think absolutely did love listening to this album would be mainstream music journalism outlets, your Rolling Stones and the like. I am absolutely going to eat my words when this album wins 5 Grammys in a couple months, but I think I'll be okay with that. I just wanted to talk about how I felt about something. Numbered scores are always fun, so let's go with 35 out of 100. By the way, thanks for watching. This has been my first video, and I enjoyed it. I want to talk about music that I thought was really cool. I want to talk about music that I thought really sucked. And I look forward to doing it again. At the time of me recording this, Chromacopia by Tyler the Creator should be coming out in about 2 days, and I'm immensely excited, and I want to talk about that. So, again, thank you for watching.